The day my father disowned me, he didn't raise his voice, throw anything, or slam the front door. Somehow, that made it hurt even more. If you've ever been the child your family only remembered when they needed something, you'll probably understand why I stayed quiet for so many years. And if this story reminds you of someone you know, or maybe even yourself, stay with me. Because what happened 1 week later changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and forgiveness. My name is Ethan Brooks, and until that afternoon, I believed being dependable was the same thing as being loved. My father, Richard, called and asked me to come over because there was an important family discussion. I should have recognized those words. Every important discussion somehow ended with me sacrificing something for my older brother, Logan. When I walked into my parents' kitchen, Logan was already sitting at the table, staring into a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. My mother looked exhausted, twisting a paper napkin between her fingers without saying a word. My father stood by the window with his hands behind his back like he was preparing to deliver a business presentation instead of talking to his own son. Before I even sat down, he slid a folder across the table. "Logan needs help," he said calmly. Inside were loan statements, overdue notices, and a single sheet with a number circled in red. $180,000. My father looked directly at me. "You have the savings. Your brother made mistakes, but family takes care of family." I glanced at Logan, expecting embarrassment or at least gratitude. Instead, he avoided my eyes completely. That silence told me this conversation had already happened before I arrived. They had already decided my money belonged to him. I closed the folder slowly, took a long breath, and quietly said one word. "No." The expression on my father's face changed instantly, and the next sentence out of his mouth would divide our family forever. For a few seconds, nobody moved. My father stared at me as though I had spoken a language he did not recognize. Then he gave a slow, disappointed shake of his head. "After everything this family has done for you, this is who you choose to be?" His voice never rose, but every word landed with the weight of a verdict. I felt my mother's eyes searching my face, hoping I would surrender the way I always had before. Logan finally leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You have the money, Ethan. It is not like this will ruin your life." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because of the money, but because he truly believed everything I had built belonged to him the moment he needed it. I looked around the kitchen where I had spent countless holidays fixing broken cabinets, paying unexpected bills, replacing appliances, and quietly covering expenses my parents never even knew about because I never wanted them to worry. None of that seemed to matter anymore. My father opened the folder again and pushed a blank transfer form toward me. "Sign it," he said. "You can earn it back. Your brother cannot recover from this without you." I folded my hands together and calmly slid the paper back across the table. "I will help someone who wants to rebuild," I answered. "I will not finance someone who refuses to change." Logan's face hardened instantly. "You always thought you were better than me." Before I could respond, my father reached into his jacket and pulled out a sealed envelope. He placed it in front of me with almost ceremonial precision. "Then this conversation is over," he said quietly. "If you walk out of this house without helping your brother, you are no longer part of this family." My mother gasped softly, but she never asked him to stop. My hands remained steady as I opened the envelope, and the first line inside made my heart beat slow instead of race. The letter was barely half a page long, but it carried more finality than anything I had ever read. It stated that from that moment forward, I should no longer consider myself a member of the Brooks family, that I would receive nothing from my parents in the future, and that any relationship between us had ended by my own choice. I read every word slowly, then folded the paper along the same crease and slipped it back into the envelope. My father seemed almost surprised that I was not arguing. "That is all?" he asked. I nodded once. "If this is the price of saying no, then I accept it." My mother covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes, but she remained silent. Logan looked relieved, almost comfortable, as though an obstacle had finally been removed from his path. I stood, picked up my jacket, and looked around the kitchen one last time. It suddenly felt less like the home where I grew up, and more like a stage where everyone had already memorized their lines except me. My father opened the front door without another word. As I stepped onto the porch, he said quietly, "Do not expect us to call when you realize your mistake." I answered with the only truth I had left. "I hope one day you realize whose mistake this really is." The drive home felt strangely peaceful. I expected anger, but all I felt was exhaustion, followed by an unfamiliar sense of freedom. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages from cousins, aunts, and family friends accusing me of abandoning my own brother when he needed me most. Somehow everyone knew the story, yet every version painted me as selfish. By afternoon, an email arrived from my bank confirming a credit monitoring alert. Someone had recently attempted to verify financial information connected to my name. I frowned, assuming it was a mistake, until I noticed the address attached to the inquiry. It belonged to the same law office my father had used for years, and suddenly I realized this family meeting had never been only about asking for money. For the next 3 days, I did absolutely nothing. I did not call the law office. I did not respond to my relatives. I even archived every message without reading past the first sentence. For the first time in years, I refused to become the family firefighter rushing toward every emergency they created. It was unsettling how quiet my apartment felt without the constant expectation that someone would need money, advice, or another favor. I went to work, met deadlines, cooked dinner, and slept through the night without my phone lighting up every hour. That silence should have felt empty, but instead it exposed something I had ignored for years. My entire identity inside my family had been built around solving problems that were never mine to begin with. On the fourth morning, another notification appeared from my bank. The credit inquiry had not moved forward because additional authorization had been required. Someone had tried to access financial information connected to my accounts but had failed. I immediately called the fraud department. The representative politely explained that no money had been taken and no accounts had been opened, but she advised me to place extra monitoring on everything. When I asked who initiated the request, she apologized and said she could not legally disclose the individual, only that it originated through a legal office acting on behalf of a client. That answer stayed with me all afternoon. Why would anyone connected to my father need access to my financial history after I had already refused? Late that evening, my mother called. I watched the screen until it stopped ringing. Seconds later, she left a voicemail. She did not ask for money. She did not defend my father. She simply whispered, "Please answer your father's calls tomorrow. Things are getting worse than you know." Before I could decide whether to erase the message or listen again, another call came through. This time it was from Logan, and hearing genuine panic in his voice was something I never thought I would experience. Logan never left a voicemail. He called 3 times in less than 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as he had started. That silence unsettled me. The next morning, while I was halfway through my first meeting at work, my phone vibrated again. This time, it was my father. I let it ring until it ended, but before I could slip the phone back into my pocket, another call came through, then another. By lunchtime, there were 12 missed calls from him alone. I stepped outside the office, sat on a bench overlooking the parking lot, and finally answered. For several seconds, I heard nothing except uneven breathing. Then my father spoke, but the confidence that had always defined him was gone. "Ethan," he whispered, "I made a terrible mistake." I closed my eyes without saying a word. "Please," he continued, "just let me explain." It was the first time in my entire life that my father had ever asked instead of demanded. He sounded older, smaller, almost like a stranger borrowing his voice. I finally asked a single question: "What happened?" He hesitated long enough for me to realize the truth was harder for him than the apology. "The bank," he said quietly. "They are coming after the house." My heart sank despite everything that had happened. That house held every childhood memory I had, even if those memories now felt painfully distant. I thought Logan's investment would recover, my father admitted. I believed him. There was another long silence before he added something that made my stomach tighten. I signed everything they put in front of me. I expected anger to rise inside me, but instead I felt something heavier, disappointment. Not because he had trusted Logan, but because he had never trusted me. Before I could respond, he said 6 words that changed the entire conversation. "There is something I never told you." Then the call disconnected. Less than a minute later, an email from an attorney arrived with the subject line, "Urgent documents requiring your immediate review." My hands hesitated over the keyboard before I finally opened the attorney's email. There were 6 attachments: mortgage documents, loan agreements, personal guarantees, property records. I expected to find Logan's name everywhere. Instead, I kept seeing my father's signature over and over again, page after page, each one carrying another promise that he would personally repay debts if Logan failed. The deeper I read, the heavier my chest became. My father had not simply tried to help his favorite son. He had gambled nearly everything he and my mother owned. Then I reached the final document. A handwritten note from the attorney requested that I contact him before making any decisions because certain material facts had not been disclosed to you. That sentence refused to leave my mind. What facts? I called the number immediately. The attorney answered after 2 rings, introducing himself as Michael Dawson. His voice carried the careful tone of someone choosing every word. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "your father instructed me not to contact you unless these agreements entered default. Unfortunately, that time has arrived." I leaned back in my chair, staring through the office window as traffic crawled below. "What exactly am I missing?" There was a pause. "I would rather explain in person," he replied. "There are documents I cannot discuss over the phone." Before I could ask another question, another call flashed across my screen. It was my mother. I switched over immediately. She was crying so hard she could barely breathe. "Ethan," she whispered, "your father collapsed after leaving the bank." My pulse jumped. "Is he all right?" "The doctors say he is stable," she answered quickly. "It was the stress. Everything is falling apart." Then her voice became almost inaudible. "Logan finally admitted he lied to all of us." My entire body went still. "About what?" I asked. My mother did not answer. Instead, she quietly said, "You need to come to the hospital. Mr. Dawson is already here, and he brought the original file your father kept hidden from you for years." By the time I reached the hospital, the sun had already disappeared behind a blanket of gray clouds, making everything outside feel as cold as the knot growing inside my chest. My mother stood the moment she saw me, her eyes swollen from crying. For a second, it looked like she wanted to hug me, but she stopped herself halfway, as though she no longer knew if she had earned that right. Mr. Dawson stepped forward, carrying a worn leather file that looked decades old. "Your father asked me to keep these documents sealed unless the family reached this exact point," he said quietly. We sat in a small consultation room while the sounds of nurses and rolling carts drifted through the hallway. He opened the file and spread several documents across the table. The first pages confirmed everything I already knew about the loans. The last pages changed everything. Years earlier, after Logan's first failed business venture, my father had secretly paid off nearly $300,000 in debt. He had told the entire family that Logan had rebuilt his life through hard work. It was a lie. Every time Logan failed after that, my father quietly rescued him again, borrowing more money while telling everyone that success was just around the corner. Then Mr. Dawson placed another document in front of me. It was a financial summary showing every transfer I had ever made to help my parents over the past 8 years. Every dollar had been recorded because my father insisted they were temporary loans. None of that money had repaired the house or covered medical bills the way I had been told. Nearly all of it had gone directly to covering Logan's losses. My mother buried her face in her hands as the realization finally reached her. At that exact moment, Logan walked into the room. He looked at the papers covering the table, then at my father lying silently through the glass window outside, and in a trembling voice said the words none of us ever expected to hear. Dad never knew the worst part. I lied to all of you about where the money really went. The room fell completely silent. Even the steady beeping from the monitors outside seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Logan lowered himself into a chair and stared at the floor. The confidence that had carried him through years of excuses had vanished. The investment failed almost immediately, he admitted. I kept telling Dad I was one deal away from fixing everything. Every time he paid off one debt, I created another because I was too ashamed to tell him I had already lost the money. My mother began crying again, but these were different tears. They were not for the house or the loans. They were for the years she had spent believing one son was selfish while the other was simply unlucky. Mr. Dawson quietly gathered the documents into neat stacks before looking at me. Your father never intended for you to carry this burden, he said. He believed protecting Logan meant protecting the family. By the time he realized the truth, the debt had become too large to escape. I looked through the glass into my father's hospital room. He was awake now, staring toward the ceiling with the expression of someone replaying every decision that had led him there. For the first time, I did not see the man who had disowned me. I saw a father whose love had slowly turned into denial until it consumed everything he had tried to save. A few minutes later, a financial advisor from the bank arrived with revised options. The house could still be saved, but only if the guarantees were restructured and several assets were sold. Logan quietly volunteered to liquidate everything he still owned, including the truck he treasured and the small lake cabin he had insisted would someday make him wealthy. Nobody argued with him. Nobody tried to protect him anymore. As we left the consultation room together, my father slowly turned his head toward me through the open doorway. His eyes filled with regret, and without speaking a single word, he raised a trembling hand as though asking for one final chance to be my father again. I walked into my father's hospital room without knowing whether I was there as his son or simply as the last person still willing to listen. He looked older than I remembered, not because of the gray in his hair, but because regret had a way of aging people overnight. He tried to speak several times before the words finally came. I spent so many years protecting the child I thought was weakest, he said quietly. I never realized I was breaking the one who never asked me for anything. I pulled a chair beside his bed and let the silence settle between us. For once, neither of us rushed to fill it. My mother stood near the window with tears in her eyes, while Logan remained outside the room talking with the financial advisor about selling what he still owned. Nobody blamed anyone else anymore. The excuses had finally run out. Over the following months, the house stayed in the family because the loans were restructured, the unnecessary assets were sold, and Logan accepted a steady job instead of chasing another impossible opportunity. It was not a miracle. It was simply the first honest decision our family had made in years. My father apologized more than once, but I eventually told him he did not need to keep repeating the words. An apology only matters when life afterward begins to look different, and little by little, it did. He stopped asking me to rescue everyone. He started asking how I was doing instead. It felt unfamiliar, almost awkward, but it was real. I forgave him, not because forgetting was possible, but because carrying that hurt forever would have kept me trapped in the same story. I never became the family's emergency fund again. And strangely, that was what allowed us to become a family for the first time. Looking back now, I realize love without boundaries slowly becomes sacrifice, and sacrifice without honesty eventually becomes resentment. I still wonder how many people have quietly lived that same invisible role, believing they had to earn love by giving away pieces of themselves. If you have ever stood at that crossroads, I hope you chose or someday choose what finally saved me. Enough courage to say no before losing yourself completely.